Good morning. I'm Randall Garrison, Member of Parliament for Esquimalt Saanich-Sooke and the NDP spokesperson for 2S LGBTQI+ rights. Today I will be tabling in the House a white paper on the status of trans rights in Canada. The white paper is about fulfilling the promise made to trans and gender diverse Canadians with the passage of Bill C-16, which added gender identity and gender expression to the Canadian Human Rights Code and to the hate crime section of the Criminal Code. This bill was a promise to deliver to trans and gender diverse Canadians the same equality and safety enjoyed by all other Canadians. This promise was a long time in coming, lagging decades behind the addition of sexual orientation protections, either through court cases or through legislation, but still a gap remained. Closing that gap began with my private member's bill, C-279, which passed the Conservative majority parliament in 2013 but died in the Senate despite widespread public support for trans equality. After ongoing pressure from the community, Bill C-16 came back 3 years later as a Liberal government bill and finally became law in 2017. Yet today, some 6 years later, that promise of equality and safety remains largely just that, a promise. Trans and gender diverse Canadians still suffer exceedingly high levels of unemployment and underemployment, at rates as high as 80%. Trans and gender diverse Canadians are still more than 3 to 4 times as likely as other Canadians to be targets of violence. And trans and gender diverse Canadians still struggle for acceptance in public, in schools, at work, and many in their own families. We are now seeing a rising tide of hate and violence directed against the queer community generally, both abroad and at home. And its most severe consequences are falling on the trans community. We see this from coast to coast in Canada, whether it is Premier of New Brunswick attempting to roll back policies which sought to accommodate trans and gender diverse students in public schools, or in British Columbia, where so-called adults disrupted an elementary school track meet in Kelowna because of perceived gender transgressions by a short-haired 9-year-old girl. This paper is a result of broad consultations with the trans community and a literature review conducted by my principal researcher, Delana Thompson, who's been working on my staff since January, and I want to thank her publicly this morning for her work. Today, I'm not attempting to speak for the trans community, but rather to reflect the concerns and solutions we heard from this community across the country by tabling this white paper, which contains 29 specific recommendations in 10 areas. These range from ways to strengthen trans voices in Canada, to ways to make sure that we better combat hate and violence, and to ways to make sure that gender-affirming healthcare is available across the country. Together, these recommendations set out a path toward fulfilling that promise of equality and safety that we still owe to our fellow Canadians. I believe the recommendations in this report are not only reasonable and doable, but also in today's climate, they are urgently necessary. I'm happy to take questions.
Do you have any questions? I'm just curious about the kind of provincial-federal breakdown on these recommendations.
So the report focuses on the federal government, both the necessity of leadership from the federal government and the areas in which federal jurisdiction is paramount. And so, for instance, in the area of comprehensive gender-affirming healthcare, one of the recommendations calls on the federal government to establish best practices and to work with the provinces and territories to make sure that that gender-affirming healthcare is available across the country.
I have no questions online. So. Yeah. Talk to me a little bit about your stakeholder process and the consultations you did for this.
So there is, of course, a challenge in the current climate of hate and violence where anyone who is public from the trans and gender diverse community is subject to harassment online and quite often in real life. So we have not made public a list of people we talked to for this report for that reason. But this is literally several months of reaching out across the country to all the trans organizations and individuals, a review of the professional literature in this area to come up with these recommendations. And again, these are rooted in the community. These are not what I think should happen. These are what we were told by trans and gender diverse Canadians need to happen and need to happen now.
What kind of pressure can you apply around making sure that the government hears these recommendations and can do something about it?
So I intend to table this paper in the House later today. It has been shared in advance with all parties. And there are a number of issues here which I personally have been talking to the government for years, literally. And so we have examples like a recommendation that gender identity and gender expression be included in the Employment Equity Act. It's not there now. And the government has been promising such legislation for, I guess, about 7 years. We also have a recommendation that HIV non-disclosure be decriminalized, because this falls very heavily on the trans community and especially those involved in sex work. Again, the government has promised that legislation and we're still waiting for it to move forward. So I can say we're still waiting and there's urgency, but there are some signs of progress with the government on this, including the first step toward a path to safety for queer refugees, which was taken at the flag raising, and some encouraging funding announcements for some trans organizations to help make trans voices better heard in Canada. Okay? Thanks very much.